Okay, welcome to the first lecture of Modern Art, Art 123. And as you can see, you can go online and depending on what school you're at, it's HFC online, most likely with this one. And you can check out the lecture number one, and that's the one I'm going over right now. So as you can see, it's kind of a strange place to start, right? We have this kind of silly picture from an old Vanity Fair from 1878 of this guy, James Abbott McNeill Whistler. So if you're looking for something to do on the extra credit board, you could try this. You could say, um, you could write some things on what you think about this guy based on what you can see here. And even though it's a very old picture, I'm guessing you can get some ideas on what the illustrator was trying to communicate about Whistler. So take a pause and try and do that and figure out what the artist is saying about Whistler, and they'll help you out in the sections that we're going to cover. So he was born in America, but he moved to, like a lot of artists we're going to look at in this class, in 1855 to Paris. And then later he lived in London, and that's when this picture was done. So Whistler, if you've heard of him, this is most likely the piece you've heard of. And how you've heard it described is probably Whistler's mother. Um, and Whistler probably wouldn't have liked that. He called it arrangement in black and gray, the artist's mother. And so Jansen says its fame would have horrified Whistler, who wanted the canvas to be appreciated for its formal qualities alone. So on the first day of class, we did a little comparison and we talked about things like colors and lines and the thickness of lines and texture. That's form. So when they say formal qualities, that's what he means. He doesn't want you to necessarily look at this and see the details. He wants you to see this is a field of black, and here's some gray, and here's some more black. But what people on the outside saw, especially people outside of the United States, since they saw that this was, oh my gosh, Americans are really like this. They dress very strangely. They're wearing all black and they're covering their heads, and it's like they're living in a different time. So that's what people on the outside would see, and they call it Whistler's mother. But Whistler was really going for something kind of like, if you think of instrumental music, where he just wanted you to appreciate it, not for the words that you would have in music with lyrics, but just for the sounds and the textures and the way that the music brings you up and down. So that's what he was going for with his art. Another piece you may have heard of his is this one called Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, because it's over at the Detroit Institute of Art. And it actually looks quite a bit different in person, in my opinion. It's almost like you can see more details in the picture that I have here. So the types of things he was going for and he was influenced by were music. So a lot of music, if you think of classical music or you think of like dance music, a lot of it is instrumental, and people can still experience it in a way that they can enjoy. And that doesn't mean you don't have to be educated in the music to understand it either. You can just feel it and get a good impression from it just from listening to it, even if you're not experienced in music. But other people at the time, including art historians and scholars and other artists, thought it was the best if artwork had images that you could recognize, and even better for some of them if the images taught a lesson. So John Ruskin, who was one of those people, said that this was like flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. And Whistler would reply to that it is an arrangement of line, form, and color first, and I make use of any incident of it which shall bring about a symmetrical result. So for Whistler, it's kind of like when somebody's composing a song, they want to have these nice sounds here and these nice sounds here, and it'll affect you in a way that you can't necessarily explain in words, but will have kind of a more direct effect on you. So what happened is Ruskin did something kind of silly. Uh, he started to print this kind of stuff in newspapers, like the thing flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, basically accusing Whistler of ripping people off. And Whistler took advantage of some of the laws in England and the UK against libel. So what libel means is that you say something publicly, and it makes it more difficult for the person to make a living. In other words, to get paid for what they do for a living. So Whistler said, well, I'm going to sue him for libel in court. So he did. And he actually took to the witness stand. And the lawyer for Ruskin, whose name was Holker, he says, talking about this painting, do you think you could make me see the beauty in that picture? And Whistler said, and he actually said this because they have transcripts, no, I fear it would be as impossible as for the musician to pour his notes in the ears of a deaf man. So making that connection between music and also making fun of Holker a little bit. So his idea, Whistler, with making artwork is it doesn't necessarily have to represent something you can recognize. Although if you look closely, you can kind of see that this is fireworks along the water, and you can even see a figure in here. But he's more about art for art's sake. In other words, art can just exist and be appreciated for itself, and not have to teach a lesson or not have to have images of historical figures or religious figures or modern figures. So this is where we kind of speak, and we saw this a little bit in the first kind of discussion we did, where we compared the modern crucifixion to the old crucifixion. And it's about the role of art in society. So in other words, artists and other people in the public and scholars and art historians and also critics, they have certain views about what art should do, what kind of subjects it should have, and how it should function in society and how it should affect people. So Ruskin had a particular view on the how art should be, the role of art in society. And he said Ruskin believed that art possessed power to improve society. For him, this was accomplished chiefly through an artwork's ability to represent nature faithfully. To encounter nature in its purity and grandeur for Ruskin was to contemplate the divine. Artists who adhered to this doctrine of truth to nature could, he thought, promote moral virtue as well as aesthetic pleasure. So when Ruskin's talking about making things be faithful to life, he's talking about pictures that look like something that you can recognize, even if it's not exactly real. And I'm putting up the air quotes for that, meaning the figures in it might look like idealized or impossibly perfect people. But to him, it was a good idea to make it look like something that could exist. Whereas when you look at Nocturne in Black and Gold, and nocturne is a musical term, Chopin's got a lot of great nocturnes from this time period, if you're interested. Instead, Whistler is going for colors, lines, the way he uses the paint and the feelings that come out of that, just like people would do with instrumental music. So instead, Whistler would think of things as art for art's sake. Art, Whistler explained, has become foolishly confounded with education. So to him, it doesn't have to exist for this greater purpose. And I'm putting out the air quotes again. Instead, it can kind of exist on its own and be beautiful as is. So I'll read this quote from Théophile Gautier. And he's speaking actually about 40 years before this painting was made. But it's a similar type of idea that Whistler was talking about. Someone has said that literature and the arts influence morals. Whoever he was undoubtedly a great fool. It was like saying green peas make the spring grow, where peas grow because it is spring. Nothing that is beautiful is indispensable to life. You might suppress flowers and the world would not suffer materially. Yet who would wish that there were no flowers? I'll just make a side note. And if we got rid of flowers, actually, that would change the world a lot. But, Gautier didn't know that. So back to Gautier. I would rather give up potatoes than roses. There's nothing truly beautiful, but that which can be can never be of any use whatsoever. Everything useful is ugly, for it is an expression of some need, and man's needs are ignoble and disgusting, like his own poor and infirm nature. The most useful place in a house is the water closet. That's the bathroom, if you're not familiar. Um, so what he's talking about here is that he's kind of like thinking, things that don't have a use, they don't teach a lesson, they don't necessarily make a picture, that those things are really enjoyable in themselves. And he would rather have those sorts of things in his life than the sorts of things that have to teach a lesson or have to follow these certain rules as to what is beautiful. So the origins of modern art. And this is a tricky one because just the word modern art isn't super easy to define. But in this class, you can kind of see we're defining it more or less as the art made since the 19th century, since the mid 19th century. We'll talk about in this section about how the art styles that happened before what we call modern art and how they affected the artists and the type of art that we're going to look at in this class. So first off, we'll look at, and again, this is all kind of like background, so you can understand the art that we're actually going to study. So making art and artists, the role of the critic. So by the way, I don't consider myself to be a critic. I'm not even sure how that works. I'm an art historian, so I describe things. I don't necessarily tell people whether they're good or bad. So the second part, what does it mean to be an artist? From academic emulation toward romantic originality. So academic, I'll define that when we get there, and it'll make a lot of sense, I think. So the last one, making sense of the turbulent world, the legacy of neoclassicism and romanticism. So we'll study these two styles that preceded what's usually called modern art, and we'll kind of show how they affected it. So making art and artists, the role of the critic. So first off, I should mention that critics didn't really exist. You probably, if you're familiar with critics, it's less likely art critics and more like movie critics. But they did have art critics that do the same things that movie critics do, but they didn't really exist in the Western world before the 18th century. So we're starting in France for a couple of reasons. Uh, the first one being that most of the artists we're going to look at in the first like 50, 60 years are going to be in France. And secondly, because Paris in general, France in general, but Paris specifically had a big effect on the type of art that was being made all around Europe. Much later in the class, we'll get to the rest of the world, not just Europe. So a couple of things that happen in France, art is education. So the king and other elites were patronizing these types of things. In other words, giving money for it and setting it up. So one of the things they set up was the Académie des Beaux-Arts in 1795, and that's a school for artists. And at that school for artists, they have very particular ideas on what art should be, how it should function, what its subjects are, and how it should look. So we're going to talk about that. The relationship between artists and the patrons started to change during this time. So I'll talk about how since the 1600s or so, we started to develop things like mercantilism and then capitalism, which is a system that's we're still in today. And we start to see, instead of artwork being made just for churches and for royal elites, we're also seeing wealthy people who are starting to become interested in art, people who got new wealth and power from the systems of mercantilism and capitalism. So as you might imagine, these people who wouldn't have necessarily the same ideas on what is good about art. But remember, the king founded the Académie des Beaux-Arts. So one of the roles of the critics is to kind of tell these people who hadn't experienced art before and tell them what's good. And I'm putting up the air quotes for that. So the relationship between artists and patrons starts to change during this time. Before, a lot of artists, you had to get someone, and I'm talking about a couple hundred years before, you had to get someone in the church or an elite royal to sponsor you. But nowadays, there were wealthy people that would sponsor people or just buy your work. So then we also have the relationship between the art and the general public. Even before the French Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit, um, there was an idea that there should be more participation of regular folks. So people like you and I, unless you're a royal or something like that, and the things that elites have been enjoying for a long time. So art is one of those. So we start to see things like the Paris Salon, which began in 1725, where there's a bunch of art that is in this show and it's judged. And I'll talk about how it's judged in a moment. And the general public, so even regular folks like you and I, could go and see the art. So art criticism kind of started where it would be basically pamphlets that would be passed out at the salon to help all these people who didn't really know about art understand the art. Um, so the Paris Salon was originally done by something else that was also founded by the king, the Académie Royale du Peinture et du Sculpteur, which means the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, which was founded in 1648, but the salon begins in 1725. So I show you this picture of the salon, and it tells you a little bit about how the salon worked. And I'll talk about it in more detail. But sometimes when you go to a modern art show, they'll say that it's a salon exhibition. They mean that they're covering every inch of walls with paintings and every inch of the floor with sculptures if they can. So that's a salon type of thing. So as you might imagine, artists who try to get their paintings into the show, because not only are there regular folks like us showing up, but also wealthy people who might buy your paintings, they want to get the best spots. So that certainly encourages you to have big paintings, but the people that judge the salon at the academy would decide where the paintings would go. So if your painting is way next to the floor, most people aren't going to see it. If it's too high up, also most people aren't going to see it. If it's somewhere in between, perfect. A lot of people are going to see your paintings. So what kinds of paintings at this academy for painting and sculpture do they think were the most important or the best ones? These schools, they basically looked at painting and said there's 5 genres of painting. And this is an order, it's a hierarchy. So the one at the top is the most important. So I'll start with the bottom though, because that's what I like to do. Start with the bottom. So number 5, the least important genre according to the Academy, was genre painting. And genre painting just means paintings of real life. That's it. It's just like either regular people or rich people just doing their thing. So that genre painting is considered to be the least important. And then there's still life. And a still life is what you probably expect it to be. It's a painting of a bunch of things on a table and nothing moves because, nothing's alive. And you might think, why is that more important, a bunch of fruit or something on a table than genre painting? Because often these still lives would be used to teach a lesson. So they teach a lesson about, not spending too much money on opulent things, instead trying to be careful with your money. Talking about showing like flowers or rotting fruit and saying life is short, you better be careful. So that's part of the reason why still life is considered to be more important by the Academy than genre painting. Then the third one is portrait. So a portrait could be of an important person or of just an idea of a person. But again, the idea is to either show something of the character of the person or express an idea about how people should be or could be. So that's why that's even more important than still life. And then a landscape is a picture of a landscape, like you said, like, so it could be mountains, it could be flat ground, it could be a bunch of houses. You generally don't see people in it. And then if you did, they'd be very small. You're probably asking, why is this more important than portraits? Because landscapes can often express ideas like the sublime. The sublime means the terrifying hugeness of nature, or of the way that people conceive of God, that God is so awesome, that God could not be perceived by mere humans. So by showing landscapes, by showing humans small in these big spaces, it can express big ideas. That's what they believed. And then a top genre, and the artists there in the academy, they want to work towards this. And the big old paintings that you see, the biggest ones, are an example of history painting. So history painting can be a couple of things. It can be religious art, or it can be art that's from ancient Rome and Greece, especially they liked in 18th century France. And the idea with these is they tell important stories, but they also teach important lessons, philosophies, and beliefs about how the world should work, basically. So history painting is the top. I don't agree with this. I'm a big fan of genre painting, but this is what academy painting was. So they called this idea of what art should be academic art. So this is an example of what the academy in France would consider to be great art. So the first thing I would ask you is, when I brought this up, and you can kind of pause and talk about it in your head for a little bit. But what was the first thing you looked at when I brought this image up? Then secondly, what I'd ask you, take a look at the masculine figures and the feminine figures and tell me how they differ. So take a pause and try to kind of answer these questions yourself. And then when you're ready, start it again. So hopefully you had some ideas. Usually what most students say that they looked at first when they look at this painting was right here. And there's a good reason for that. It kind of makes an X. It's also right in the middle of the picture. You can see how we have these arches, and this part is right in the middle of the picture. And there just seems to be a bunch of lines that are pointing towards it. So what that tells you is, if you look at something first, the artist did that on purpose. They wanted you to look at that first, and they're usually telling you in this academic painting style that this is the most important thing. And then on the right, you see that the feminine figures are, according to this painter, less important. So I'll give you the story of what David is trying to tell in this one. So it's a history painting. So it's a story that's probably a legend, not a real story, from ancient Rome. And it's called The Oath of the Horatii. So the Horatii are pictured right here, and they are a family in ancient Rome. But again, who knows if they existed? All the people here are Horatii as well. So Horatius is the head of the family. So the whole family is called Horatii. So that's Horatius right there with the cool curly hair. And the Horatii are actually having a family feud, a quite violent one that's really bad for both families, with the Curatii. So they said, this can't go on anymore. We can't have all these like revenge fights, and people are literally getting killed and nobody can do anything. So they decide, the Horatii and the Curatii, to have a fight between the three strongest men of each family to the death. And whoever wins gets to dictate what the other family does. So business type stuff. So both of the families see this as being pretty important. And you can see this here. So Horatius, he's got his three sons, and he's holding up the swords, and they're all saluting. And you can see how their bodies are super stable. They're making these triangles. It's all straight lines. They're very muscular. Even the older Horatii is very muscular. And what they're telling you, the painter's telling you, is this is the most important part. So that's what you might have seen. The masculine figures are more muscular and there's more straight lines. You may have noticed over here that the feminine figures, they have curved lines. And if you look at their bodies, they're not as muscular. They're very soft everywhere. So what David is doing is showing an idea using line, but also other elements that we talked about, that illustrate what is considered to be masculine and they consider masculine things to be rational. And then what is considered to be feminine, and they consider feminine things to be emotional. So emotional lines are considered to be curved lines, and rational lines are considered to be straight lines. So you may recognize these ideas still exist today. We do still live in a patriarchy, even though women have far more power than they used to in most societies, and a lot of societies, not everyone. So you might recognize this idea that men are rational and women are emotional, and that's a contrast, something that doesn't actually exist in real life, but expresses some of these ideas. But what David wanted to talk about was something more specific to his time, and he's using this ancient story to express it. This is 1784, and people like David wanted to bring down the king. They wanted to bring down royalty, and they wanted to replace it with a republic. So if you're not familiar with what a republic is, the government of the United States is a republic. It's a type of government that's run by elected officials, at least in theory. It never actually works that way in practice. So what he wants at this time is a republic, like the ancient Romans had before they had an empire. But he knows that the king has a lot of forces to stop this from happening, and it will take sacrifice. And many people will have to sacrifice their lives if they want what David and other people believed is a better source, a better type of government. If they want this to happen, they might have to sacrifice their lives. And through this idea develops an idea of nationalism. Nationalism meaning pride in your nation, which isn't the idea of a nation isn't really something that existed so much before this time. Most people just thought of themselves as, I have a family and I have friends and I live in this village. They didn't even think of the king or other things like that. But to make things like a Republican revolution happen, which did end up happening eventually, they believed that you had to have this belief in your nation. So as French people. So he's using this ancient story to say, yes, it's going to take sacrifice. And nationalism is more important than what's going on in the background. So back to the story of the Horatii. Why are these women so emotional? Why do they seem to be sad or even crying? Part of the reason why is because all of these men are their brothers. So the mother and the two sisters, they're going to possibly lose a brother. But the story gets thicker. One of the figures in this picture, this one right here, is having a romantic relationship with one of the Horatii, the other family. And that particular man that she's having a relationship is going to be fighting against her brothers. So no matter what happens, she's either going to lose her romantic partner or she's going to lose a brother. But notice what David is doing. These are things I'm kind of feeling what the women are feeling more. Like, what are you guys doing? But David is saying that this sacrifice, and in the case of ancient Rome, it's basically for business, more or less. But remember, David is trying to connect it to a Republican revolution. This sacrifice for the nation is more important than sacrifices for family. That's what he's trying to say with this picture. So this was the style of art, the style of history painting. It was considered to be, by the Academy, the most important style. So over time, there's a lot of changes that happened, especially beginning in about 1800, but developing slowly before that, that changed society completely and kind of create the world that we're all living in right now. And I'm focusing on Europe, but later in this class, we will talk about artists around the world. So a couple of things develop in the couple hundred years before this time. In Europe, other places in the world had some of these developments. So two classes of people, and classes just means like most of you, if you're listening to this, you're working class, meaning you have a job and you get paid for a wage. And then in our society, a ruling class would be people that own things and pay other people for a wage, or have property, they're a landlord, or they're a wealthy person like Jeff Bezos that owns a company, or wealthy investors like Buffett. So that's the two big classes in our society. Um, but they had different classes in medieval Europe, but we start to see a couple of new ones develop and become more important. So the middle class, which really never existed before that, and the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie are people who own things that they can either get rent from or they can pay people wages to work with. So this style, which was this like kind of organization of society, which eventually become capitalism, is called mercantilism. And originally, the reason why it's slightly different capitalism because kings and queens are still considered to own most of the land, and therefore make most of the decisions under mercantilism. We'll see with capitalism that the capitalists own most of the land and most everything else as well. So that's a kind of different thing. But with this rise in the middle class and bourgeoisie, they got some money. Not as much as the very elite, like kings and queens in the church, but they do have some money. So we start to see artists create smaller works for these kind of new rich people. The Industrial Revolution, which kind of comes out of capitalism, begins in about 1800. And we start to see capitalism around Europe become the way that society is organized. And then by the end of the 19th century, the way the entire world is organized. And we're still living in a capitalist world today. So capitalism creates even more classes of people that hadn't existed before. There's industrial workers. And the industrial workers in the past have been people like peasants or people that worked in the city. Slowly over time, especially in England, but then in other places as well, their land that they used to own and be able to work on was taken away from them. This is a process called enclosure. And with having no land or anything to work with, they were kind of left with no way to make a living. So they are forced to go to cities and get jobs from capitalists. So the capitalists are the people that own factories. They own property that they might rent out, like a landlord. And they are investors. They can take a lot of wealth and they can put it into either land or factories or anything along those lines. And they don't make money from working; they make money from the interest that they acquire. And then the same thing with the capitalists. Capitalists don't make money from working; they make money from getting a bunch of workers to work for them, getting paid less than the value of the things that they make. And then same thing with landlords. Landlords don't make money by working; they make money by controlling some land and then charging more for it in rent than it costs for them to maintain it. So these two classes of people never really existed in Western society before. And as you might imagine, since their interests are quite different, for instance, capitalists that own factories want to pay workers the least amount possible, whereas the workers want to make the most amount possible. The capitalists would want to, and you can kind of think of Amazon nowadays, they would want the workers to work as long as possible with the fewest breaks, and they don't want to pay them benefits. Whereas the workers, they want the opposite of all that. They want to work shorter hours. They want benefits. So because of these varying interests, there's conflict between these two new classes of people. And this is going to affect the art. It's going to affect the entire world. Capitalism was voracious and took over the entire world, but it's going to affect the art and the artists and the types of things that people talk about in the art. Another thing that happens during the late 18th century, it develops, but it really develops in the 17th century with the so-called scientific revolution, so Newton and Galileo and such. But the Enlightenment really comes into its own as far as changing how the world works in the 18th century. And a lot of the people who were in the French Revolution and the American Revolution consider themselves to be part of this movement of enlightenment. The idea was to move away from what they considered medieval times to be, so the times from about 600 until 1500 AD. Those times were like a dark ages, where people were controlled by the church, or controlled by kings. Not exactly the case, but that's what they believed. And then they saw themselves in the Enlightenment as being rational. They look back to ancient Greece and Rome and the philosophers, and they tried to say we should organize society differently. We should have a republic or a democratic type of societies. We should have more freedom for individuals. And a lot of these people had different ideas on what the Enlightenment should be, and some of them influenced the revolutions that happened. But remember, even though the Enlightenment has some pretty great ideas there that are great to agree with, because we also have the system of capitalism, it kind of changes how the ideas of freedom and democracy work for most people. So most people are going to be working a wage, either at a factory or in other places. So back to Whistler, and this kind of relates to like what's going on with the painting, because when Whistler does something, a painting like this, you might imagine it doesn't take a long time. And that was part of the thing that Ruskin was saying, like, this didn't take you very long. And he had his lawyer ask some questions. So in the trial, and we're back to the libel trial with Whistler, Holker asked, did it take you long to paint Nocturne in black and gold? How soon did you knock it off? Whistler replied, oh, I knocked one off in a couple of days. The barrister then asked Whistler if it was merely the labor of 2 days, for which he charged more than 200 pounds. 200 pounds, I think, is about $10,000 nowadays. So to this question, Whistler responded, no, I asked for it the knowledge of a lifetime. So in other words, Whistler's kind of expressing what workers would express. When you do a job for a long time, you get better at it, and it's hence more valuable. So even if it took you less time, you're paying for all the experience that it took for the artist to be able to create these types of effects. I think that's a really good point. It's something you can think about in your own life. So back to David, just to show you, before Whistler and before the other modern artists we'll look at, the idea from the academy was art education should be first to perfect earlier styles. So when you look at something like David's The Oath of the Horatii with its realism, where everything is very clear and the colors are very bright, and everybody looks like they have perfect bodies. So it's real only if you believe that a lot of people exist like this, you know. If the Horatii actually existed, they probably didn't all look like models. But you can see how the style is very similar. It's just something that was very old. So academic art is inherently conservative, meaning it doesn't really want to change things. So this is Poussin from 100 years, more than 100 years before David, and he's working with the same types of styles. He has these idealized extra chubby babies and idealized extra soft women. And we have, even idealized backgrounds with the beautiful sky, and all the colors are bright and exactly how you would expect them to be if it was like just a perfect sunny day. And everything is arranged just so in the picture. So you make this nice little pyramid in the middle of the picture. That was what was all artists were expected to do. So you might imagine the effect of this would be to prevent change from happening in art. And as you might also expect, artists would be not so happy with that. So some artists, especially beginning in the 18th century, began to think about how they could change things, do things a little bit differently. So what does it mean to be an artist, from academic emulation, so copying, toward romantic originality? So William Blake, he's actually very early in this romantic style of art. And this is his picture called Nebuchadnezzar. If anyone's a fan of the Hannibal TV show, William Blake is mentioned in it. very interesting way. So this is from 1795, and William Blake is often considered to be the first romantic artist. And the best way to describe romantic would be, normally when we use the word romantic nowadays, we're talking about people who um, are lovers. You know what I mean? But it's a bigger meaning than that. When we talk about romanticism, and whether it's art or music, we're talking about things that are emotional. And in a way, that's um, to kind of look at the paintings we looked at before and be a contrast. So it's a reaction to the rationality. Instead, you want to be emotional. And on top of that, you don't necessarily want to copy what other people do, but you want to look at things through your own feelings, through your own lenses. So romantic art values artists doing their own thing. So art's unique vision. So with Nebuchadnezzar, and again, you could pause the video and take a look at this and see if it helps you understand a little bit. But I would compare and contrast. So neoclassicism is the style that we saw in this David painting. It was popular in France and other places at the end of the 18th century. And then Romanticism is the style that followed it, beginning in the end of the 18th century. And we'll see continuing through the 19th century. So what I would do is pause the video and kind of look at, maybe make a list of things that are different or the same in each picture. So kind of pause the video and you can get an idea of it. Okay, so if you're back, I'll just say some things that students often say in this class. They'll often say that this one looks realistic. And I'll ask them, what looks realistic? They'll say, well, look at their bodies. Like, even though they're, big muscular bodies, they look like ones that could exist in real life. And then they'll say that the picture on the right, Nebuchadnezzar, isn't realistic. Like, it sort of looks like a person, but nobody's body looks like this, and nobody's feet look like this. So it's something that's away from realism. People also mention things like the colors are very bright in this one, and this one, they're very dark, kind of disgusting in a way. um, and then people will mention that um, it looks like a realistic space that you can walk into, whereas this one, you can't really tell. It's a cave, but you don't necessarily feel like you could walk into it. And they also mention how the facial expressions in the one on the left are pretty blank. There's not a lot going on. Whereas with Nebuchadnezzar, we see his brow is furrowed, his mouth is downturned and open slightly. It's almost like he's freaked out by something. So that's what it is. The story is from the Old Testament in the Bible, and Nebuchadnezzar was turned into a beast because of his bad ways, basically, because he was a bad person. And William Blake chose to portray that literally, and we can see all the kind of pain and suffering he's going through, and we can see it actually show up in his body. He's turning into a beast. So some of the artworks you see during this time, and we'll see this throughout the class, they kind of exist in spaces where there are two styles. So when we talk about styles like Romanticism and Neoclassicism and later styles we'll look at, those are just helpful categories when you're looking back. But most art exists in multiple styles at once. So this is a pretty good example. This is Ingres, and then, believe it or not, that's how you pronounce his name, or Ang even. And it's his Grand Odalisque. So in this one, you can see some elements that are romantic. So romantic artists like to have so-called, and I'm putting air quotes up, exotic things. So to Europeans at this time, the exotic would be anything that's not from Europe, basically. So it was trendy at this time in the 19th century that things that were from Turkey, and I'm putting it the air quotes because most Europeans wouldn't understand Turkey. Turkey was just shorthand for saying what we call the Middle East nowadays. So you can see the turban. We got a hookah over here. And then we have this really cool kind of duster thing, and some of the jewelry. And Europeans at this time could actually collect stuff from the Middle East. So this stuff is probably pretty accurate. But the rest of it, the concept, not so much. But it's helpful to learn about because these concepts still exist in modern society. And you'll sometimes see elements of it when you hear news stories talking about the Middle East. So it's kind of useful. So you might notice like this woman, you might say, well, she's probably not Middle Eastern. She's looking kind of pale. And that's the case. That's what they wanted to do. What Ang is showing, besides wanting to show a naked woman, he's trying to show that this is a European woman in a harem in Turkey, and trying to show that like even in other parts of the world, people consider white women to be beautiful and they'll capture them and put them in their harems. So as you might imagine, this is a fairly racist idea. And Aang probably wasn't even aware it was racist, but he's definitely expressing these racist ideas. And then instead of thinking of the hookah as like what people actually use hookahs for, tobacco and flavors, instead, this is supposed to be opium, and that's how they would control people. So this idea of the exotic, I'm putting up air quotes, which is like quite racist, is something that you see in romanticism sometimes. And it's kind of important because these kinds of ideas that in the rest of the world, people are perhaps more emotional or more interested in old things and they don't change. These types of ideas are really important in justifying imperialism in both in this time and in modern times. So kind of keep these ideas in mind. So a lot of times the romantic artists would take very old stories, but unusual ones. So this one, The Death of Sardanapalus, is about an ancient Assyrian king who was about to be defeated. A conquering army was coming into his city, and you can see the burning in the background. And he ordered that everyone in his harem and all of his horses and everything else be destroyed so the conquering army couldn't get it. And that's what we're seeing right now. As you might imagine, Sardanapalus is right here looking calm, but everything else is chaos because of the order that he just gave to like melt down all the gold and literally slaughter all the women that were here, and all of his servants. So if you kind of look at this picture, one useful way to look at it, to see it as romantic, remember how I talked about curvy lines are emotional? Also, curvy lines that seem to be disorganized are thought to be emotional by artists at this time. So if you kind of like squint your eyes and try not to see the details, you can kind of see how the lines are going everywhere in all different directions. And that kind of expresses the chaos of the image. So he's very, and you can kind of contrast the facial expressions compared to what we saw in David and the Oath of Horatii. That was also a traumatic event, but this one actually looks traumatic. People are suffering, and we can see that in their faces. So Delacroix doing kind of a romantic style here. And also, again, they love to put these things that kind of represent the Middle East. Not accurately at the time, ancient Assyria didn't have things like this. But again, it's for Europeans to understand that this doesn't take place in Europe. So Delacroix would continue with this style, even using thicker paint sometimes. Like in neoclassic paintings, you can't see the paint at all. In this one, you can see big, thick globs of paint. And kind of like we had talked about in the first day, that adds an effect that can be kind of more intense or more emotional in this case. And a lot of artists thought about that, about how you use paint and how you can express feelings. So when I bring this painting up, I'll usually ask the class, what do you see first? And they'll be like, this right in the middle. Besides it being in the middle, these bright orange, red and yellow colors kind of tell you something. So Delacroix spent a lot of time in England. He was a French artist, as his name suggests, and he influenced English artists like J.M.W. Turner, who made this painting. But Turner's kind of going farther. You can probably recognize what's going on here. There's a building, there's a bridge, and there's some water. But the paint is even thicker, and there's even fewer things that are easy to pick out. But as you can see, it's the burning of the Houses of Parliament. And you definitely get the feeling of something very intense happening. So if Parliament is a huge building, it's burning, and you can see it's going to be very intense, and you can see the reflection of it in the water. So artists realized by kind of having fewer details and using intense colors or lots of thick paint, that you can get really strong emotions. Remember, Romanticism is about expressing emotions. So even again, styles kind of overlap, and it's not always easy to put artists in styles. We'll talk about realism a little bit later on, which is probably the earliest modern style that we're going to study in this class. And Francisco Goya, even though he's making art long before the people that actually called themselves realists, this was made in 1814, he's doing some things that are realistic. So when I talk about realism, I'm not talking about things look like they do in real life. Instead, the realist artists, who we'll study later on, they wanted to portray real things. So when somebody says, like, let me be real with you right now, that's what the realist artists are talking about. It doesn't necessarily look real, but showing things as they are. So if it's a messy event and people would look kind of awkward, then you show that. If it's a boring event, you would show everybody being bored. If it's an intense and violent event, you show the intense violence. So that is what Goya is doing with this, the 3rd of May. So he's writing this in 1814, long after the events. And he's writing it basically so that he's making this painting so that people don't forget what happened. So probably predictably, in France, after the Republican Revolution, it only lasted for a little while before they became an empire. And the empire was headed by Napoleon. And sometimes when you think of Napoleon in modern times, you think of someone that's kind of silly or short or something. But how you should think of Napoleon is Hitler, because to most of Europe, that's what he was. Once he gained control, he tried to expand French holdings throughout the world, but also throughout Europe. And he took over Spain and occupied it, as Hitler had with Spain as well during World War II. So as you might imagine, the Spanish people don't want to be occupied by the French and used for their empire. So there would often be people who were fighting against it. So this painting was made after the occupation of France had ended, but it's referring to the 3rd of May in 1808 while the occupation was going on. So what happened is there was a lot of revolutionary groups, and some of these one revolutionary group got together and was able to kill a couple of policemen. So policemen are the soldiers. That's how police developed. They were the soldiers that were trying to control the populace that was being occupied. Modern police forces developed out of these types of forces. That should be illustrative to you. And the cops slash soldiers couldn't find the people who did it. So what they did is they just gathered up random people off the street and executed them. And you might imagine what their intended effect was, to try to make everyone in fear so that they will stop the revolutionaries. So we can see here the violence of this event. We see all the soldiers and we don't see their faces. We see nothing. We just see the people who are about to be killed and the people that had been killed. And the reason why this is kind of a realist painting is because all of the blood is shown, and all of the horror and like kind of disturbing, graphic, and grotesque type of violence is shown. But you see one figure, and I usually ask the class, what do you think about this figure with his hands up? Does he look like somebody? And oftentimes people will be, it's like Jesus hanging on the cross. And surely that's what Goya was doing with this. You can see the light flashing on him. And because of that, we kind of want to look at him first. So it is very emotional, has some thick paint like Romantic painters would do, but it's also realist because it's showing things as they were without filtering out any of the details. So he made a series of prints explaining the horrible things that the French police / soldiers had done to Spanish people, executing people randomly. I'll just say that if you look these up, these disasters of war series from Goya, some of them are much more violent than this one. So that's a content warning. But he wanted to show how things were and kind of work through these types of things himself so that it would never be repeated. So other artists kind of worked in between these styles in interesting ways as well. So Jean-Francois Millet in his The Gleaners, it's kind of a realistic painting in that it's showing people doing normal everyday things. It's also kind of a history painting in that it has, according to Arneson, a grandeur customarily reserved for biblical or classical heroes. So we're seeing the people who are working. The Gleaners are, I'll explain who they are in a minute, but the people that are working, we see them organized just like you would see like Mary and Jesus in a painting, or you would see the ancient Greek or Roman heroes. So it's showing these people who are regular working folks. It's showing them as big, as part of a history painting. So it kind of tells you what Millet is trying to do, perhaps. So what gleaning is that, and at this time, more and more farms were, instead of owned by the farmers, they were owned by big land owners. And that meant that a lot of people that used to be farmers didn't have enough food. Again, capitalism. So there was a tradition that went way back in France that continued into this time period, into the 1850s, where after a field was harvested, people who were poor and didn't own their own land could go in and they could glean whatever was left from the harvest. So that's what's going on. So you can see how a lot of these styles can be mixed together. This is almost neoclassic in a way, but it's also realistic to put a, kind of do a message saying, these people who are poor are important and we should be thinking about them. So the conclusion of this so far, and it's kind of long, sorry about that. We have the two different styles and then kind of the mixtures of the styles that we looked at, romantic versus neoclassic. And Arneson says something kind of interesting, and you can think about it yourself or try to think about what it means and maybe post on the extra credit board if you want. Modernism might be best understood as a struggle between forces of objective rationality and subjective expression. So objective rationality would be what you see, and subjective expression would be not only what you see, but what you feel about it. So that's all for the first lecture, and I'll post more as we go along.